Chandan
Hello
sir, it is.
everyone. Yeah, thank you. Hello everyone. Good evening to one and all. This is again Chandan Kumar. I, on behalf of Scientific Committee Visha, welcome each one of you in the celebration of Balance Awareness Week. Thank you so much for joining with us. We have covered by now two topics: basics of balance system and sign and symptoms of vestibular disorder, importance of case history, and various questionnaire. Today, our topic of presentation is audiological test in evaluation of vertigo. And to present this topic, I am pleased to invite Dr. Praveen Kumar sir. Sir has completed his graduation in speech and hearing from AIMS Delhi. He completed his post-graduation from ICE Mysore. Sir currently serving as an associate professor and HOD audiology at ICE Mysore. Sir has received many grants for the projects where he is either principal investigator or co-investigator. He served as an author and co-authors in 75 scientific papers in national and international conferences. He is a recipient of Muktesh Award for Best Paper in Audiology, Dr. M. Raghunathan Memorial Award for Best Paper in Poster in Audiology. He is having more than 50 publications in peer-reviewed international and national journals. He also received Young Scientist International Travel Grants from Indian Council of Medical Research, New Delhi, to present scientific papers in Taiwan. Over to you, sir. Let's celebrate.
Thank you, Chandan, for sharing the credentials of mine. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank BISHA, Bihar State Branch of Indian Speech and Hearing Association, for giving me an opportunity to share knowledge with you all, and whatever information is there with me, I'm just going to share with you for 40 to 45 minutes. So today I am going to talk about audiological test in evaluation of vertigo. I think audiological test is supposed to be very well familiar with you all, whether you are pursuing, speech and hearing courses. I mean, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate or doctorate, as well as professionals. So most of the things what I'm going to talk about it must be familiar with you here and there. Some of the things, I will just try to, share with you if it can help you after going through this particular presentation or attending this presentation. So as I said, both the pictures here, whatever is mentioned here, which is representing the peripheral and central auditory audio vestibular system, must be familiar with you all. You can see that the first picture, which is representing the external ear, middle ear, and inner ear. You must be wondering why I'm sharing this particular picture. The other side, you have the efferent auditory pathways, where you can see that starting from the cochleas, and then there are nerves which is passing through different nuclei, which you most commonly named as CNS limca, and then ultimately it's reaching to the the cortical structure, the auditory cortex. So why I wanted to share with you this particular picture, and most of you must be familiar with this auditory structure and the vestibular structures, they are very close by. At some point of time, they are sharing together, and so we were discussing about what are the audiological tests which is available with us when we are dealing with a patient with vertigo. So that's what I was talking about you all, that whether you do behavioral measures, behavioral assessment, or whether you do physiological or electrophysiological test, when you are dealing with the vestibular cases, when you are dealing with the patient with the vertigo complaint, all these tests, what is listed here, whether it is a pure tone audiometry, speech audiometry, and some of the spatial tests which helps you to differentiate cochlear and retrocochlear pathology, such as CC, short increment sensitivity index, tone decay test, Beckesi, and then you have a glycerol test specifically for Meniere's disease cases. So these are the behavioral measures which you do it routinely in daily basis. But what you need to do is you have to be little bit having a keen observation with reference to these tests when you are handling with vertigo patient. Similarly, in physiological and electrophysiological measures, emittance evaluations when you are doing with tympanometry or acoustic reflexes or autoacoustic emissions, and auditory evoked potential, which is considered as a gold standard test in audiology domain, which includes routine click evoked ABR, and then CHAMP, which is cochlear eye drops analysis masking procedure, and then electrocochleography, which is early evoked potential. So these physiological and electrophysiological tests also supplement additional information and which help you to diagnose those individuals who are having a vertigo in a better way, and it always complement to each other along with the dedicated vestibular assessment. Okay, now this particular slide talks about the pathology which is affecting balances or the vertigo or the vestibular disorders. So I have categorized here three different components. One is the labyrinthine pathology, that is your purely inner ear problems, such as I'm sure yesterday when Dr. Sujit was presenting with you all the case history and other vestibular disorders. He shared all these conditions, most of the conditions he shared with you all in yesterday's presentation. So I hope those attendees who attended yesterday's presentation also will able to recall back. BPPV is benign proximal positional vertigo, then Meniere's disease, superior canal dehiscence, perilimb fistula, labyrinthitis, enlarged vestibular aqueduct syndrome, ototoxicity, noise-induced hearing loss. These are all inner ear pathologies. Neural pathologies like vestibular neuritis, vestibular schwannoma, vestibular paroxysmia, vertebrobasilar insufficiency, stroke, auditory neuropathy spectrum disorders, multiple disc sclerosis. So like that, you have the neural pathology, and then mixed pathology where you can see that the diabetes mellitus and hypertension is considered as mixed pathology. That means a combination of labyrinthine as well as neural pathology. Both are involved in that. And in addition to vestibular migraine, and yesterday also we had a lot of discussion on that, and the vestibular schwannoma. So you can see that mixed pathology is quite common, especially the diabetes mellitus and hypertension is quite common. And you can imagine the role of audiologist when you are dealing with these disorders, and they reported balance issues as well. So first I will talk about little bit about these audiological tests, and then I will try to share with you the relevance of these audiological tests with reference to the vestibular pathology, what I listed it in previous slide. So I'm sure pure tone audiometry is well known to you, very basic audiological evaluation. The day you enter in speech and hearing and audiology, field of audiology, you start dealing with air conduction and bone conduction threshold. But let me tell you, though it is a very basic test, it gives you good amount of information if you are trying to retrieve and if you have a very good observation. So it helps you to know about the qualitative hearing loss in terms of different type of hearing loss, whether it is a conductive, whether it is a sensory neural, whether it is mixed. It helps you to quantify also whether it is mild or moderate or whatever degree. Then configuration across the frequencies, how do you get the responses? That also is having a significance with reference to different pathology. Like I will be talking about Meniere's disease, where you will see in early Meniere's disease cases, you get low frequency hearing loss. Then asymmetrical hearing loss, it's basically about 1 year is normal, another year is having some amount of hearing loss. So even asymmetrical hearing loss, you will able to identify through pure tone audiometry. So altogether, what happens is, though it's quite a basic evaluations, any patient comes to you, you must be doing pure tone audiometry, but then it helps you to assist in differential diagnosis of ear and balances. If you have a very good observation and you can able to clinically correlate this particular test. In addition to that, when it comes to the middle ear, there are two factors, stiffness and mass dominated factor. So basically here, I wanted to stress upon with reference to, the configuration of hearing loss when you get high frequency hearing loss versus low frequency hearing loss. So stiffness and mass is playing a role. And with reference to the vestibular disorder, like one of the condition is endolymphatic hydrops, and that's where low frequency hearing loss is observed in early stages. So this particular factor, I'm sure most of you must be familiar with that, is also playing a role. So mass dominated factor, which gives you an indication of high frequency hearing loss. Higher frequencies are more affected. Apart from that, of course, these two factors do have a role in middle ear physiology. I'm sure most of you must be aware of it, but then I just wanted to recall it back. Whatever is known to you. Then it comes to speech audiometry, where you do SRT, you try to obtain SRT, you do speech discrimination score or identification score, PIPB index, rollover index, that is phonemically, performance intensity phonemically balance index. Then, so this speech audiometry also basically helps you to supplement whatever you get, in the pure tone audiometrical evaluation. And then you try to see the correlation between the two, whether it has a good correlation or it has a poor correlation. So I'm sure most of you rely most of the time on test battery approach, and test battery approach is a multiple test you do and then try to clinically correlate whether it helps you in assessment, and then think about further intervention. So it helps in distinguishing, the cause of hearing loss. In speech audiometry, I wanted to stress upon PIPB function, which is having a very significant role in differentiating cochlear versus retrocochlear pathology. And whatever I listed in vestibular disorders in cochlear pathology, like labyrinthine pathology, and retrocochlear, like neural pathology, this neural versus labyrinthine pathology, you will able to differentiate. It helps you in differentiation with this PIPB function, that is rollover index as well. You can see here that the minimal rollover is noticed even in the cochlear pathology, but then there is a significant rollover in case of retrocochlear pathology. So this, with reference to the different intensity level and obtaining the SIS, help you to differentiate this cochlear and retrocochlear pathology. So it supplements to your other test what you have done it. In addition to that, as I said, you do have other special tests, though it looks like endangered test most of the time. Most of our clinicians these days don't prefer to do this. I do understand sensitivity and specificity is not as good as it's supposed to be, whether it is ABLB, CC, and tone decay and Becker-C audiometry. But if you are good clinically in making a judgment, these tests will help you and supplement the information with other audiological tests. So ABLB help you to know even about if it is a asymmetrical hearing loss or unilateral hearing loss. ABLB, that is alternate binaural loudness balance test, will help you to identify presence or absence of recruitment. I'm sure recruitment, you must be familiar with this term. Recruitment, most of the time recruitment phenomena is associated with cochlear pathology. So basically at higher intensities, they perceive abnormal loudness primarily because of dysfunction of outer hair cells. Then you do have Becker-C audiometry in most of the audiometer, which help you to know whether it's a cochlear or retrocochlear, or they have normal physiology. At the same time, this 1 dB increment in short increment sensitivity index, that also help you to differentiate. You can see the vertical line in two extreme is basically the identification between cochlear and retrocochlear pathology. The fourth one is indicating you the tone decay test, where any procedure, whether you follow Hood procedure, whether you follow Carhart procedure or Olsen and Knopfsinger procedure, basically you are trying to see whether there is a decay over the duration. As you are increasing the duration, whether there is a decay with reference to the auditory nerve or not. So basically you are trying to see the abnormal adaptation phenomena which is associated with retrocochlear pathology or neural pathology. Glycerol test, quite common. Most of the clinicians who are dealing with vestibular disorders, they prefer to do this particular test in venous disease cases. So when you are trying to administer this particular test, basically you will be having a glycerol. It's basically a hygroscopic material, so it has a properties of absorbance of water content. So what happens in endolymph, if you know a little bit about the pathophysiology of venous disease, where there is an excess accumulation of endolymph in scala media, and because of that there is a bulging of resinous membrane. So if you use this particular material in active stage of early venous disease condition, what happens is this material helps to ease the pressure, and there is an improvement in the threshold. So if you do pure tenodemetry, you will see that pre and post there is an improvement in threshold. If you do whether electrocochleography or ABR, there is a you will see that early latency is appeared. So and even vestibular test like CWEMP also, they tried out pre and post glycerol. So basically this particular glycerol you're supposed to administer with reference to the weight of the patient multiplied by 1.2 milligram, and it has to be equally mixed with water or juice. And once you orally administered this, you can repeat the test after 2 to 3 hours. And positivity depends upon the phase of the disease, that whether it is in active stage or it's in dormant stage. The improvement, if it is greater than 10 dB at least 2 adjacent frequency, then only it is considered as a positive finding. But please remember, this particular test you are not advised to perform when you are dealing with diabetes patient. So diabetes mellitus is a contraindication for glycerol test. Here one example of glycerol test where you can see red color is pre-glycerol, and blue color is post-glycerol, and you can see that in low frequency there is improvement by more than 10 dB, which is an indication of positive venous disease, whereas in high frequency we don't see any improvement as such. Then it comes to emittance evaluations, basically to know about the status of middle ear. So you have tympanometry, acoustic reflexes, and then a spatial test as reflex decay test, which helps you to differentiate CP versus RCP. So I'm sure most of you must be familiar with these graph, which basically tells you the compliance, and the x-axis you have pressure. So across the pressure, when you are changing from extreme positive to extreme negative pressure, how the compliance is changing, and this rate of change of pressure helps you to know the status of the middle ear, that is tympanic membrane, and even the tympanic cavity. So this is again test battery where middle ear status help you to supplement when you are dealing with the vestibular cases. I will be sharing with you with reference to the different pathology how the significance of this tympanometry is relevant when you are dealing with the vestibular patient. Acoustic reflexes, again, it helps in assessing integrity of the stapedial reflex. It provides an information about the afferent and auditory and efferent nerve. Acoustic reflex usually is present in normal hearing individual at near about 60 to 80 dB HL. If you recall back the pathways of the acoustic reflex, whether it is ipsilateral or contralateral, you can see that there are two cranial nerves, that is 7th cranial nerve and 8th cranial nerve, which is involved. So basically it tells you about the integrity and whether the pathway is intact or not. So this presence or absence of acoustic reflexes or elevated acoustic reflexes help you to understand whether the reflex pathway is intact or there is some mismatch with reference to the reflex arc. Reflex decay test, as I said, this is again help you to assess abnormal adaptation. If an individual whom acoustic reflex is present, you do it at the suprathreshold level, that is a 10 dB above from the ART, and you try to see that whether there is a 50% decay before 50% of the time, and the presence of reflex decay is associated with retrocochlear pathology, this abnormal adaptation, and that's again significant in case of neural pathology cases. Autoacoustic emission, some of the vestibular disorders like auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, you can see that cochlear functioning is absolutely normal, but then there is a mismatch and there is a disorders above cochlear pathology. So again, this autoacoustic emission, which is non-invasive and quick in administering this particular test, gives you an idea about whether the outer hair cells functioning is normal or not. And at the same time, prior to doing an autoacoustic emission, you have to ensure that middle ear functioning is normal, because if there is a middle ear functioning is not normal, autoacoustic emission absence, the absent OEs may be because of middle ear pathology. So you have to ensure that middle ear condition is absolutely normal. Auditory evoked potential, where most of us rely on click evoked ABR, but then that in cases of vestibular schwannoma, eighth nerve tumor, this click evoked ABR, conventional ABR is not helpful, and that's where you rely more on stacked ABR. And at the same time, a pathology like Meniere's disease, there is a specific design of a method which is prescribed by Dawn et al. That is cochlear eye drops analysis masking procedure, and that help us to identify active versus active Meniere's disease cases. At the same time, electrocochleography is also helpful in identifying Meniere's disease based on the summiting and action potentials ratio. I will just share with you how it is clinically relevant when you are dealing with vestibular pathology cases. So ABR is basically a site of lesion test. So if there is any disruption of auditory neural transduction, it may be because of neoplasia, it may be compression or invasion of the cranial nerve or the brainstem, or demyelination anywhere along the central auditory pathway. Why there is a possibilities of abnormal ABR in vestibular pathology cases? Because that due to the close anatomic relationship between vestibular and auditory nerve, as well as between vestibular and cochlear nuclei, auditory system abnormalities may be associated with concomitant vestibular abnormalities. So basically, it helps you in providing information about central vestibular pathways. So that makes sense doing conventional ABR as well as modified ABR. This particular slide gives you an information about the different conditions, like when a normal ABR waveform versus the different pathological conditions like conductive hearing loss, sensorineural hearing loss, or auditory neuropathy spectrum disorders. You can see that morphology is not same across different pathological conditions. I'll be dealing that how this interpeak latencies and interoral latency differences play a role, as well as morphology and the ratio of fifth and A and the interpeak latencies gives you clinical significance when you're dealing with different vestibular pathology cases. This cochlear eye drops analysis masking procedure, here what happens is this particular procedure is given by Dawn in 2005 and 2007. So what you do is you do multiple ABR recordings. First you do it click alone conditions, and later on you add high pass masking noise of different frequencies. So you can see that in extreme left you have 8 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, 1 kilohertz, and 500 hertz high pass masking noise. And after that you derived from these responses. So you can see click alone is here. Apart from that, the rest waveform is derived from the difference between the two. So this is the difference of 11.3 kilohertz. What waveform you can see here, it is a difference between click and click plus 8 kilohertz high pass masking noise. Pretty similar to that, the difference between 8 kilohertz high pass masking and 4 kilohertz, it is derived 5.7 kilohertz. So like that you have 2.8, 1.4 and 0.7 kilohertz, and all these derived band ABR, first it is matched with reference to the peak, and then it is sum up, and after summing up these derived responses, basically that's also summing up is also named as a stacking, and this stacking gives you the significantly peak to peak higher amplitude, and this particular response help you to differentiate with clinical conditions like presence or absence of tumor, CP angle tumor, and other vestibular schwannoma cases. So the stacked ABR is considered as having a very good sensitivity and specificity in terms of identifying CP angle tumor. And CHAMP is considered as very good sensitive tool to identify Meniere's cases. So we do have some amount of our laboratory outcome. In this particular slide, you can see that we use CHAMP to identify Meniere's disease, and as per Dawn references, they suggested 0.3 as a difference for the Meniere's disease to be identified, and they could able to they reported 100% sensitivity and specificity, whereas when we replicated this particular study and we could able to see that if we are considering 0.3 millisecond difference, we got the sensitivity of 93.1%. When we increase the cutoff criteria of less than 0.48, we could able to get 100% sensitivity. So we slightly differ what Dawn and their group reported about the sensitivity of CHAMP to identify Meniere's disease cases. Electrocochleography, as I said, this is early latency evoked potential, where we try to look into summiting and action potential. If you see in this particular graph, where you can see that in normal hearing individuals, the summiting potential, the ratio of summiting potential and action potential is 30%, whereas if in the Meniere's disease cases, the summiting potential and action potential ratio is higher, that is 60%. So basically the summiting potential increases in Meniere's disease. Again, this reflects back to the pathophysiology behind Meniere's disease. So this is one particular condition where ECOG will help you to clinically assess this particular condition. In addition to that, ECOG is also most often used in auditory neuropathy spectrum disorders to identify the presence or absence of cochlear microphonics. This is from our laboratory, where Vishu and Singh in 2012, they tried to see that those individuals who are affected with Meniere's disease, how the action potential latency difference is, and you can see that the action potential latency difference varies with reference to the unaffected Meniere's disease or sensorineural hearing loss or the healthy individuals, and it shows significant differences across the group as well. And they reported the ratio, amplitude ratio was greater than 0.35, and that's indicate Meniere's disease. Now again, I am putting up this particular slide because now I am going to share with you the different vestibular pathological conditions and their interpretation with reference to the audiological test. I will not be discussing with you or sharing with you any of the vestibular tests, because my colleague will be sharing with you on later date, whether it is CVEMP or OVEMP or VHIT or other behavioral vestibular test. So I will be only restricting myself to audiological test, whatever till now I shared with you, their methodology and their interpretations. So benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, BPPV, this is primarily a vestibular condition which is associated with pathologies in semicircular canal, and since it is a purely a vestibular conditions, you will see that when you are getting a BPPV case and you do audiological evaluation, you will see that cochlear structure, the cochlea and auditory nerve system are completely spared. So you will, when you do the pure tone audiometry, most often you will get normal hearing sensitivity. There will be a good correlations of speech discrimination score with PTA. You will get no medullary problems, A-type tympanogram. Acoustic reflex threshold also will well correlate with pure tone audiometry. If you do click evoked ABR, conventional ABR, there also you will get good morphology. Since in BPPV there is auditory system, cochlea is totally spared, and even auditory nerve there's no issues, you won't get any indications in audiological test. You have to rely on vestibular test to identify BPPV. Meniere's disease, I think I already shared with you. When you do PTA, you in early stages of Meniere's disease, you will get low frequency or picking pattern. Picking pattern is somewhere at 1 or 2 kilohertz, you will get a pick. But again here, speech discrimination score will have a good correlation with PTA depending upon the loss. Tympanometry, you may get A or AS type. Acoustic reflex threshold, sometimes it may be associated with recruitment phenomena. So you will find out, acoustic reflex threshold at lower level, usually most often lesser than or equal to 60 dBSL. Autoacoustic emission, depending upon the hearing loss, may be partially present or absent. ABR will have, again, with reference to the hearing loss, morphology will be good. But as I said, CHAMP and ECOGSY is, two clinical audiological tests which help you to, diagnose Meniere's disease better. So CHAMP, you will get less than 0.3 millisecond gap. And this difference is minimal between click alone and click plus 500 hertz. Basically, it's a compared click alone condition and click plus 500 hertz high pass masking noise. Basically, there is an under masking phenomena which is happening in the Meniere's disease cases, and because of that reason, you get lesser, differences between the two. ECOGSY, you will get SPAP ratio greater than or equal to 0.45. Here again, you will see that all these findings are pretty similar in a pathological vestibular pathological conditions, that is vestibular migraine. The only difference you will see is in terms of hearing loss. In Meniere's disease, you see some amount of hearing loss, but then in vestibular migraine, you may not, you don't see any, hearing loss. They will have absolutely normal hearing. Vestibular migraine is a neural pathological condition. Superior canal dehiscence or perilimb fistula. This is again, superior canal dehiscence is associated with semicircular canal. This is an anatomical, deformities. Usually they have the, very thin membrane. There's a missing bone, and that leads to low frequency conductive hearing loss. And when you do the pure tone audiometry, you will see that bone conduction threshold is supranormal. Even if, air conduction threshold is normal, bone conduction threshold is -10, -5, -10, something like that. So you will get a good amount of airborne gap, even though there is no hearing loss, or there is some amount of low frequency loss. So you get a conductive hearing loss, okay, when you do pure tone audiometry. And that correlates well with your speech audiometry. But here what you will see that because of that missing bone and there is anatomical deformities there, you will see that uncomfortable loudness level is slightly reduced. And because of that reason, if you do tympanometry or acoustic reflex threshold you are trying to obtain, you will see that they may feel, louder, they may not be comfortable, and they may report you, some amount of uneasiness. And because of that, when you are trying to induce their, ear presenting loud sound, there is a possibility of observing nystagmus or vertigo, during emittance or obtaining the uncomfortable loudness level. So that needs to be taken note. And acoustic reflex will be present or well within the normal range depending upon the loss. Autoacoustic emission also will be present. See here again, though it's a conductive hearing loss, but then cochlear functioning is normal. And ABR also you will get it as you are getting in normal hearing individuals. In terms of perilimb fistula, this fistula is most likely you will be seeing either near the oval window or round window. And apart from that, rest of the audiological test is as similar to superior canal dehiscence. Labyrinthitis, this is basically the infection of the labyrinth. So in this case, again, when inner ear is infected, there is a possibility is either you will get different degree of sensorineural hearing loss or maybe mixed hearing loss. But with reference to the hearing loss, there is a good correlation with pure tone average. Since there is a hearing loss, there is a possibility that autoacoustic emission you may not be able to see. It's absent TOE or DPOE. Waveform and latency is appropriate to the hearing loss. If you do click evoked ABR, you will see that depending upon the hearing loss, that correlates well with your ABR. Acoustic reflex threshold also is noticed at lower level only, since it's a cochlear hearing loss. Reflex decay test, if you do, you will get negative reflex decay test. There is no decay because there is no retrocochlear pathology. Again here, this labyrinthitis and vestibular neuritis The difference between the two is presence or absence of hearing loss. So presence of hearing related symptoms helps you to differentiate between vestibular neuritis and labyrinthitis. In vestibular neuritis, you don't see hearing loss, but then labyrinthitis, you will see that either some amount of sensorineural hearing loss or mixed hearing loss is noticed. So as I said, for the differential diagnosis, it's very important for you to have clarity on the different audiological test, how it can help you to differentiate between two conditions. Enlarged vestibular aqueduct syndrome, again here you will get mixed hearing loss, but then it correlates well with PTA, A-type tympanogram. Since it's a mixed hearing loss, there is a possibilities of absent acoustic reflex, as well as autoacoustic emission TOEs also will be absent. And if you do the conventional ABR, it's a pretty appropriate with the degree of hearing loss. But remember, again, this particular condition, enlarged vestibular aqueduct syndrome, is most often it's a congenital condition, so it will be there from the birth. So when you are taking case history, yesterday when Dr. Sujit was sharing with you the importance of case history, the case history is going to help you along with these audiological tests, whether it's a congenital or it's acquired, so that help you to understand the pathological condition. Ototoxicity, I think yesterday also we had a good amount of discussion on cochlear toxicity versus vestibulotoxicity. And there are many ototoxic drug which is not good for our auditory system and ear, but most often you will get the steeply sloping sensorineural hearing loss. And since you are getting a steeply sloping sensorineural hearing loss, and hence you will have poor correlation with pure tone average. It may not correlate well, but middle ear absolutely will be fine. So you will get most often A or AS type tympanogram. Since it's a cochlear pathology, acoustic reflex threshold you will get depending upon the degree of loss, may not be at higher frequencies, maybe only at lower frequencies. Again, TOE and DPOE presence, functioning of outer hair cells depends upon amount of loss. You may get partially presence of autoacoustic emission and absent if loss is severe. So it depends upon the hearing loss. Even auditory brainstem response depends upon the degree of hearing loss. If there is a sharp, steeply sloping hearing loss, clicky walked ABR may be absent. But then remember, this particular conditions again damages either the vestibular regions or the cochlear region, depending upon the different kind of ototoxic drug. But then it do have impact, and some of the ototoxic drug do impact both cochlear as well as vestibular structures. Noise-induced hearing loss, again, this is a cochlear lesion. It's a labyrinthine pathology. So most often in initial stages, you will see notch or dip at 4 kilohertz or 6 kilohertz, but then there will be a good correlation here with PTAs. You will not see, until unless there is a comorbid condition, you won't see, middle ear issues. So A-type tympanogram, you will see acoustic reflex present if, loss is lesser. Autoacoustic emission again depends upon the degree of hearing loss. In early stages, you will see presence of OEs partially or absent if loss is severe. ABR is again appropriate to the hearing loss. But remember here, you will very rarely see the vertigo, the true spinning sensation. If you remember to yesterday's presentation, we discussed about the different kinds of vertigo, that acute and chronic, and then true spinning sensation. NIHL cases, you may not see that they are reporting true spinning sensation. Most often they report imbalances, because it's primarily because noise-induced hearing loss damages both the cochlea or both the cochlear and vestibular structure in a similar way. It's not that one inner ear is damaged, another one is spared. So because of that reason, they will have an imbalances rather than true spinning sensation. Vestibular neuritis is a clinical entity selectively caused by unilateral affection of the vestibular nerve or the vestibular end organ. And one of the studies, I looked into it, and they reported most often vestibular neuritis individuals will have normal hearing threshold. Other literature also reports pretty similar to that. you will not see any issues. When you do ABR in vestibular neuritis cases, you will get normal waveform and latencies. But even the reflex decay test shows negative. But in this particular studies, they reported elevated acoustic reflex threshold. But then most often literature do talk about normal acoustic reflex threshold, because in vestibular neuritis again, auditory nerve is spared in most of the cases. It's purely the vestibular structure which is damaged, and hence audiological test will not give you any clue to know about the vestibular neuritis condition. Vestibular migraine, this is again one of the most common causes of episodic vertigo in adults with if you remember studies so stoned. Okay, so there we talk about acute and episodic vertigo and the different pathological conditions, the symptoms, and other conditions. So in this particular condition, vestibular migraine, you will see most often they have the episodic vertigo, and prevalence is somewhere around 1%. And in one of the study there, they reported in vestibular migraine again, pure tone audiometry will not show any degree of hearing loss. It's normal hearing sensitivity in both ears. And speech identification score is correlates well with PTA. But most often they observe tinnitus is seen in vestibular migraine cases. And the reason they are giving is though the vestibular migraine most of the time mechanism is not known, but the most accepted theory is that migraine induced vasospasm. So it's related to the blood supply which is seen in the brain. That is one of the reason leads to decrease in the blood flow to the inner ear, and that's where you get the sensation of migraine associated with vestibular structure. If at all hearing loss is seen, you will see the bilateral hearing loss, sensory hearing loss, but most often it is normal hearing. Vestibular sonoma, I think most of us are familiar with this. Most often pure tone audiometry will show unilateral high frequency sensory hearing loss. There are some of the exceptions where you may see low frequency sensory hearing loss, such as in brainstem tumor, as well as in neurofibromatosis 2, you may see bilateral sensory hearing loss. Otherwise, if it is not NF2, if it is not brainstem tumor, so that's where I say in internal auditory canal, if you take a cross section of that, if you recall back, you will be able to see that there is a facial nerve, there is a superior and inferior vestibular nerve, and then you have eighth cranial nerve. So depending upon the location of these tumor, whether it is having more proximity with superior and vestibular nerve, or whether it is having more proximity with eighth cranial nerve or the facial nerve, the symptoms appear, that tried symptoms where we talk about hearing loss, tinnitus, and vertigo. So most often it is a unilateral high frequency sensory hearing loss is observed in vestibular sonoma cases. And again here, speech audiometry SDS will not give you very good correlations. They have the poor speech discrimination score, but then middle ear is absolutely fine, so you will get A or A step tympanogram. Acoustic reflexes may be elevated or absent, and since it is retrocochlear phenomena pathology, when you do reflex decay test, if acoustic reflex is present, though it is elevated, you will see positive decay, and click evoked ABR may not, it will be affected if it can able to identify depending upon the size of the tumor based on the inter-peak latency difference or inter-oral latency difference. In addition to that, if click evoked ABR is not giving you a clue about vestibular sonoma, then you should go for a stacked ABR, which will show the reduced amplitude that is less than 0.3 microvolt. Vestibular paroxysmia, again, audiological finding is pretty similar to vestibular sonoma in most of the cases, that is more than 50% of the cases, but they may have the paroxysmemia. I think yesterday, they explained you there is a loop formation, and because of that, most often you will see the positional vertigo or hyperventilation induced vertigo in vestibular paroxysmia. Auditory neuropathy spectrum disorders, I think very familiar term now in last 1.5 or 2 decades. A lot of research such is done. So you know that Peotron audiometry will give you either normal threshold or it reaches up to the profound sensory hearing loss. So it's a wide variety of Peotron threshold. Of course, speech audiometry will give you speech discrimination score is very poorly correlated with the Peotron average, no correlation at all most of the time. And when you do speech perception in noise, that spin, when you are presenting ipsilateral noise and trying to find out, a speech score, you will see it's very poor in ANHD cases. Middle ear is absolutely fine. So you will get tympanometry A type or AS type, and acoustic reflexes, most often it is absent, or sometimes you may get elevated acoustic reflex. TOE will be present because cochlea is spared, so outer ear sense functioning is normal. So in fact, in initial stages of ANSD, you will get robust TOEs. And ABR, either it will be abnormal or absent. In some of the cases, you may see abnormal, it's a noisy waveform. So you may say delay in latency, but then you may able to identify a little bit of responses in clickable area. ECOGC, very, very important demand when you are dealing with ANSDs. Most often you try to look for cochlear microphonics, and even the SP-AP ratio is increased. And this presence of cochlear microphonic, absent of ABR, and presence of OEs help you to identify ANSD cases. I'm not going into the different type of ANSDs. So that's all about different vestibular pathology. So this is my last slide. As a summary, whatever till now I have discussed, I put it in single slide with reference to Peotron audiometry, speech audiometry. That is specifically in speech audiometry, I have stress upon speech discrimination score, then tympanometry, acoustic reflex threshold, reflex decay test, otoacoustic emission, whether it is TOE or DPOE, ECOGC, and ABR. So you can see here, a reflex decay test is having a significance when we deal with vestibular schwannoma or vestibular paroxysmia. And when it comes to the otoacoustic emission, you can see that BPPV, you will get presence of OEs, even superior semi-canal dehiscence, perilymph fistula, and then a vestibular migraine, and then auditory neuropathy spectrum disorders. When it comes to the correlation of speech discrimination scores, everywhere there is a good correlation except vestibular schwannomas and vestibular schwannoma, and then auditory neuropathy spectrum disorders. So that's all from my side. Once again, I would like to thank Bisha and as well as Isha for giving us platform to share my experiences and knowledge with you all in this particular topic. At the same time, I would like to thank Director Ash Maishuru for permitting me to present with you, and of course my Department of Audiology, for helping me to come out with this presentation. I will be happy to take up questions from you all.
Thank you so much, sir. It's a really excellent talk and a really very good slides, and especially the profile of each case, and the last slides was really amazing, compiling everything, and each one will would love to have with us in our mobile whenever we see the case, so at least we know that which profile suiting to where.
Sure,
Now I would request,
that.
thank you, sir. Now I would like to request our panelist, Dr. Neeraj, sir. Sir, you would like to add anything? Neeraj, sir?
No, I don't want to add anything because I think Praveen has covered it very exhaustively. The only thing I would like to say is, as audiologists, we are not specifically looking at vestibular pathologies, But what we must remember is simple audiological techniques. All the tests that Praveen has talked about, I think other than maybe stacked ABR and CHAMP, you probably are able to do all the tests. It is available, even your 20K test and CC and all those things are also available in the audiometer. And there are small indicators there which tell you that this person could have this kind of a problem. So even if you don't have a full-fledged vestibular clinic, you can still make use of the audiological test to make a lot of differential diagnosis. So
Yes, sir.
we should not think that vestibular and audiological tests are different. I mean, truthfully, when the topic was shared with us, I just to retain the difference, I agreed with the topic. Otherwise, vestibular tests are also audiological tests, and all the tests are audiological tests basically, because if an audiologist does it, it's an audiological test. But here, what he's trying to say probably is all the hearing related tests. Here, you're not talking about the vestibular pathway at all the hearing related tests, and they are very important. I think they give a lot of inputs into differential diagnosis. Some of these tests are the differential diagnostic tests.
Yes, sir. Sir, can we take few questions?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I'll be happy to take.
Okay, sir. First question is how a speech audiometry will help to find cause of hearing loss. I don't know what's the question. How a speech audiometry will help to find cause of hearing loss.
Okay. Cause of hearing loss means why there is a hearing loss. As I said initially, that most of us believe in test battery approach. So if you are doing speech audiometry alone and trying to identify the cause of hearing loss, it will help you, as I said, but then you may not able to differentially diagnose, you may not able to rule out other pathological conditions, and coming back to one particular, trying to locate one particular pathology, and because of that particular pathology only leads to poor performance in the speech discrimination score, or SRT is not well correlating with your PTAs, or the uncomfortable loudness level, that is UCL, because these are the different component of your speech audiometry, what you do it, whether it's you are targeting to pediatric population or the adult population. So when it comes to the causes of hearing loss, definitely speech audiometry alone may not help you to identify, but then it will help you to differentially diagnose based on the finding of speech audiometry. I hope that's what they are looking for. Neeraj, do you have something to add on?
I think the question was not specifically related to vestibular. Probably he's asking about the cause of hearing loss. So basically, speech audiometry helps you understand whether it could be a cochlear pathology or it could be a retrocochlear pathology, and it really doesn't help you between cochlear and conductive. So, but it will be more useful in segregating, say, retrocochlear pathology from rest of the pathologies. And then you obviously have to correlate that with case history to understand that this probably is the cause of hearing loss.
Yes, sir. Can we go with WEM testing if the patient has Tullio phenomena?
Can you go for WEM
Whoever
testing?
has asked this question is not attending day after tomorrow's presentation, is it?
Why nystagmus is not associated with vestibular dysfunction?
Why nystagmus is not associated with?
Associated with all vestibular dysfunction.
No, it is associated, but not with all the pathological conditions. I'm sure Neeraj can add on this particular question.
I think what he's trying to ask is maybe why spontaneous nystagmus is not associated with all vestibular pathologies. So spontaneous nystagmus will be mainly occurring in people who have got either a central pathology or a peripheral pathology where the pathology is asymmetric. So even without stimulation, there is an asymmetry between the outputs from the two sides. That's what produces spontaneous nystagmus. I probably will shed a little more light on it in day after tomorrow. I'm trying to invite
Sure.
people to the day after tomorrow's presentation.
Yeah, because I think here we have a split it different topic on different days, but then you have to put all the presentation together when you are handling the case. Remember that patient is one person. It's not you don't need to look at hands alone and leg alone and then head alone or ear alone. You have to consider patient as a single person, and then you have to approach take holistic approach. So then only you will able to arrive a diagnosis and you will able to make better intervention for that particular patient. So yes, you have to club all
Yes,
the
sir.
presentations together. Yes.
What is the reason behind supranormal BC threshold in SSCD?
Okay, very interesting question. So as I said, there is anatomical deformities where bone is missing. If you see the radiological investigation of those individuals who are having a CD, you will see that there is a very thin membrane, and then there is no bony structure, and you know that the bone conduction pathway is more faster in comparison to the air conduction pathways. But then because of that missing bone, it gives you supra threshold. That means it's much better than what we get it in normal hearing individuals. Anything else to be added, Neeraj? SCD having supra bone conduction threshold?
Basically, the presence of SCD, because there is a third window, it augments the energy reaching the cochlea in the bone conduction mode. Whereas in the air conduction mode, when the stapes foot plate moves inside, the energy gets distributed, because now you also have a mobile window on the vestibular side. So the energy gets distributed. So some amount of energy goes towards the vestibule and some amount of energy goes towards the cochlea when air conduction mode. Because of that, the overall effect is less, and that's why you need more intensity to hear, and that produces the hearing loss in AC. Whereas in BC, when you're putting the bone vibrator, the vibration of the skull allows better energy transfer, and even in fact some amount of energy will go from the bone, from that missing bone plate. Because of that, some better energy transfer will happen from there. So it is basically going to augment the hearing in BC mode, and that's why you see supra threshold, supra normal BC threshold. That is, your BC thresholds might be like -10, -5, those kind, whereas in normals most often you might see it around 0, that kind. That is what they are trying to say. So that is what is meant by supranormal. They will hear clearly. Even a -10 dB, you will see a very crisp response.
Okay. What's the reason for mixed hearing loss in enlarged vestibular aqueduct?
Reason in the sense, see, because mixed hearing loss is there because there is involvement of, most often it so happens that since it is a congenital condition, so along with, the cochlear cochlear structures which is affected, most often you will see that they do have medullary effusion or otitis media with effusion. So because of medullary, issues, so combination of middle ear as well as the inner ear leads to mixed hearing loss in the vestibular aqueduct, and it's a congenital conditions where they don't have very good ventilations of the middle ear structures. So there is an issue with quite often they get middle ear infection. So because of that reason, you get a mixed hearing loss.
Yes, sir. Our next question is, can we differentially diagnose BPPV versus unilateral vestibular hypofunction?
BPPV versus
Vestibular hypofunction, unilateral. BPPV versus unilateral vestibular hypofunction.
Yeah, I think this one Neeraj can able to answer. Neeraj, can you
Yeah,
add on? I'm not sure about
yeah.
it.
I think I don't
This
know why are
differential.
people not asking questions specific to to the topic. In any case, I will answer that question. Um, BPPV is actually a hyperfunction. Okay, it's not a hypofunction. Please understand, it's a hyperfunction. The canal is producing kind of responses that it would not otherwise produce. It's producing more response than what it would normally do. So BPPV is a hyperfunction abnormality, whereas hypofunction. So if you understand that BPPV is hyperfunction, obviously you should be able to differentiate with a hypofunction. So a vestibular hypofunction may be a Meniere's disease, a vestibular hypofunction may be a labyrinthitis, a vestibular hypofunction may be vestibular neuritis. In all these cases, the functionality on that side reduces, whereas in case of BPPV, the functionality on that side increases.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I hope the person understood what I was trying to say.
Hope so, sir. Next question is, how do we decide to move to a stacked ABR in vestibular schwannoma? How do we know whether the conventional click ABR is not giving us any information?
Yeah, I think that's a very well-known fact that if you don't have radiological investigation done prior to that, most often you won't. First, you will be patient if patient is approaching you first time and they have not gone through the medical investigations, including radiological evaluation. So you will be the moment you get in case history and other audiological evaluation is pointing towards retrocochlear pathology. You will be doing an click evoked ABR, and but then you see that click evoked ABR is absolutely not giving you any indication of retrocochlear pathology. That means based on the interpeak latency differences or interoral latency differences. But then in case history and audiological evaluation, you do have some amount of indication of vestibular schwannoma or eighth cranial nerve tumor. So it's better to go for stacked ABR because even if it's the tumor size is very small, smaller than I think 3 mm. So even though it's very small in size, stacked ABR will help you to identify the presence or absence of tumor. So the decision about the stacked ABR is based on your basic audiological evaluation and the routine or the conventional click evoked ABR. If you can able to see the prolonged latency in click evoked ABR, probably you need not to think about the stacked ABR.
Yeah, I think you just have to look at small indicators. One is case history, as he already pointed out. So in case history, what should you look for? In case history, you should look for presence of unilateral tinnitus. That is one thing. And the second thing may be imbalance. So these are the two indicators in case history that tells you maybe I'm dealing with a patient who has a vestibular schwannoma. Additional history may be there depending upon the site and size of tumor and all that, but these two things usually are present. In addition to that, when you do an audiogram, you look at asymmetry in the audiogram for an unexplained reason. I mean, he has not had a slap on the ear, he has not had a conductive component, he has not had anything to that ear, but that ear shows, one ear shows some amount of sensorineural hearing loss, whereas the other ear may be normal, or both ears have got hearing loss, but there is a difference of more than 15 dB between the two ears. So that is what is called as asymmetry. So if you see asymmetrical hearing loss in a person who is complaining of unilateral mainly high pitched tinnitus and has some amount of imbalance may not be obvious, so you may have to probe more. But if you see these kind of signs, then it probably tells you that this person may have a vestibular schwannoma. Now when you even if when you do your speech audiometry and all, the scores might be slightly reduced, especially the masked scores might be slightly reduced, the spin may be poor. So you look at all that, but when you do your ABR, and ABR, click evoked ABR, shows normal results, you still have to go ahead and do a stacked ABR. I think he described one technique of stacked ABR which was given by Don et al. If your equipment doesn't have that facility, you can still do a stacked ABR if your equipment has a facility of doing tone burst ABRs. So you record ABRs for 500 hertz, 1K, 2K, and 4K, and then you can align them and add. But you obviously have to obtain normative data for that, so that you can then differentiate between what is a normal added amplitude versus what is a reduced amplitude. So you obtain a normative on say 30 individuals, you obtain normative, and then use the 2 standard deviation criteria. If whatever mean value you get for the amplitude, if you get 2 standard deviation below that, if whatever value you are finding in a patient is less than 2 standard deviation from the mean in the normal, use that as a criteria. So this is another way to do a stacked ABR, but indicators are, as I said.
How to differentially diagnose Meniere's with vestibular migraine based on audiological profile?
I think if you see in this particular summary slide, the Meniere's disease, as I said, you have a gold standard test in terms of hearing-based test or audiological test, where you do ECOG or you do CHAMP, and you will get a significant findings in that in terms of the shift of the latencies when you are using this click alone, and then click combined with high pass masking noise. Whereas when you are talking about vestibular migraine, you don't rely more on ECOG or ABR. You are mainly relying more on with reference to the other audiological test, or you will be relying more on the other vestibular test. So definitely you can able to identify this Meniere's disease based on the SPAP ratio and CHAMP. So this is the two specific tests which can help you to identify the Meniere's disease in comparison to the vestibular migraine cases.
I will just walk in here a little bit. As long as vestibular migraine is a pure vestibular migraine, there is absolutely no problem. You will be able to identify it because vestibular migraine invariably does not have hearing loss. So if you see a patient who has got all Meniere's like history but does not have hearing loss, there are high chances that this person could be a vestibular migraine patient. The problem comes where you are seeing a vestibular migraine patient who has got a concomitant and endolymphatic high drop. It can happen in up to about 30% of cases of vestibular migraine where endolymphatic high drops is also there. There is no clear or certain way to differentiate in such cases. Maybe the only way, I mean, even that will probably not help you. You need to understand that, okay, both features are there and maybe it is both. So maybe you treat one by one, it becomes like that. But otherwise, in a pure vestibular migraine case, hearing loss will not be there. Hearing loss is the major differentiator, and anything that can detect endolymphatic high drops, like already Praveen said, SPAP ratio, or it may be area ratio, it may be latency difference between the two polarities in ECOG, the AP latency difference between rarefaction and condensation polarity in ECOG will help you identify the presence of endolymphatic high drops. So all those things will help you. It will be useful in 70% of the cases. In those 30% where endolymphatic high drops is also coexisting pathology in migraine, it will not help you much. The case history is the only thing which will help you. In Meniere's, you don't see visual sensitivity, so people will not be avoiding light and all those kind of things, whereas in vestibular migraine people will be avoiding light most often. There will be specific triggers in vestibular migraine which will not be there in Meniere's disease. So as I said, don't just look at the audiological test alone. He said that very clearly, Praveen said that very clearly, that you have to look at all the presentations together to understand how to differentiate. So based on audiological test, those are the indicators. Based on case history, as said yesterday also, these are the indicators. And then you obviously have some of the vestibular tests which can help you differentiate that.
Yes, sir. Why is there a low frequency loss instead of high frequency loss in Meniere disease, despite being an inner ear disease?
I think
I think I missed
we
your
need,
slide, sir.
sorry, okay. I think this needs to be understood with reference to the pathophysiology of Meniere's disease. As I said,
Yes, sir.
you know, in endolymphatic eye drops, you know that either there is a possibilities of excess accumulation of endolymph or there is a less absorption of endolymph. So basically what happens, there is a you know, larger amount of or accumulation of endolymph in your sclera media region, and that bulges your you know, resonance membrane outside. Okay, and this presence of this you know, excess amount of endolymph is acting as you know, as a you know, stiffness component of it. If you remember when I was talking about you know, mass factor and the stiffness factor, you know, if you remember back, you know, the configuration of hearing loss where I was talking about endolymph eye drops is also one of the condition where system is more of stiffness dominating rather than mass dominating. So the presence of excess accumulation of this endolymph is acting as more stiffness in comparison to you know, the mass dominating, and stiffness dominating character is reflected as a low frequency hearing loss instead of high frequency hearing loss. High frequency hearing loss is most often associated with you know, mass dominating system. The another thing is we need to understand about the basilar membrane, and even the basilar membrane, if you go back to the anatomy of the basilar membrane where you have you know, the stiffness gradient and this width of the basilar membrane differs with reference to the apical end and the basal end. So these two physiology will help you to understand, you know, in active Meniere's disease or in the earlier Meniere's disease conditions, why there is a low frequency hearing loss. Anything else to add on, Neeraj?
Yes, there is it could be considered as a two-way phenomena, and both probably contribute, but we don't know by how much. One is accumulation of excessive amount of endolymph will actually exert backward pressure in the scala vestibuli, which will push the stapes foot plate out, which will then in turn go like a reverse wave, pushing the tympanic membrane out, which causes increase in stiffness at the tympanic membrane, and that will, you know, that stiffness dominant systems will create a low frequency hearing loss. So that's one contribution. But always remember, if the stiffness at tympanic membrane increases, it creates a conductive hearing loss, right? But here we are looking at SN hearing loss. So where does the SN component come from? The SN component comes from the inner ear structure itself. If you see the basilar membrane, the basilar membrane is much narrower and much more stiffer at the basal end, which represents the high frequencies, and it is much broader, but at the same time much more floppy, or I can say less stiff in the apical end. Now when there is accumulation of endolymph, it is accumulating throughout the cochlea, so same amount of pressure is being exerted at everywhere on the basilar membrane, but because the basal end is more stiff, it withstands that pressure, whereas the apical end is more floppy, So with little bit amount of pressure, now it is sagging down, it is bent down. Okay, so because it is bent down, and always remember, how do we hear? The basilar membrane's movement upwards is the one which produces hearing. The shearing between the outer hair cells, or the shearing between the stereocilia and the tectorial membrane, is what produces hearing. So the upward movement of basilar membrane is important for hearing, remember that. So now the basilar membrane is moved down because of the endolymph. Now, so when the sound comes, it will require additional amount of sound to push it up, and that's why that produces hearing loss. So that's why you see a low frequency hearing loss, because that happens more in the low frequencies.
Yes, sir. Can you explain the procedure of CHAMP? Which type of masking noise is used?
Okay, it's a high pass masking noise. It's customized specifically. I think some of the equipments you may not get, in all the equipments. Earlier, it used to be available with the biologic AEP system, where high pass masking noise is presented. Otherwise, as Neeraj was pointing it out, you can do it tone burst ABR and at different frequencies along with the noise, and you can able to identify whether the presence or absence of the eighth nerve tumor. So here in CHAMP, they are using the high pass masking noise, which is there in some of the equipments, but not in all the equipments.
Sir, what is DDAVR?
Sorry.
She's asking DDAVR. She's asking why should not
Is
use
it derived band
DDAVR instead
ABR?
of
He is
click?
asking derived band ABR. DBABR is derived band ABR. If you remember in one slide,
He
I was
says
talking about CHAMP.
He said
DB,
DDAVR. DDAVR
DB stands
instead
for
of
derived
click AVR.
band ABR. So if you remember, when one slide I was talking about CHAMP, I was talking about derived band, and then I talked about stacked ABR. So in the same slide, there were three representation. So DBABR is basically derived band ABR. This one, the second component. So basically here what is happening is you are deriving the waveform from the different recordings what you have done it in CHAMP. So the second one here, this is click alone condition. The second one, this 11.3 kilohertz what waveform you are seeing here, this is the difference between click alone and click plus 8 kilohertz high pass noise. The third one, 5.7 kilohertz what waveform you are deriving, this is deriving between the difference between this click plus 8 kilohertz high pass noise and click plus 4 kilohertz high pass noise. So pretty similar to that, the difference between these recordings, you get these waveforms, which is represented as derived band waveforms. And then what you have to do is you have to align all these waveforms here, stack it together, and then you sum it up to get stacked ABR. So derived band ABR is basically one component of your CHAMP or stacked ABR. I hope that's what they meant, what whoever asked this particular question. So DB-ABR is basically derived band ABR.
Okay, sir. Sir, can we use wideband tympanometry in a test battery?
Yes, I think now it is available. We can use it, wideband tympanometry. I specifically avoid multi-frequency tympanometry and wideband tympanometry because we don't have much literature on that. There are some of the clinics where they use it. Even we use it, for the research purpose, but not for the clinical purpose. But then definitely wideband tympanometry will help you to understand middle ear physiology much better, because you get three-dimensional picture where you get to know about the reflectance, you get to know about the absorbance, and so that gives you better clarity and picture of middle ear condition. So yes, we can use it, wideband tympanometry. And
I think wideband tympanometry in terms of I'm not sure if the person wanted to ask about whether it should be used as a test battery for vestibular assessment. It will help you in cases with Meniere's disease, because you do see that in Meniere's disease there is change in stiffness, and because of that the absorbance pattern will change, and therefore in Meniere's disease you can see a utility of wideband reflectance. There are a couple of publications on that. In fact, I have been planning a publication, I don't know, ever since maybe 2014. Others have published and I have not yet. But yeah, that's what happens. In case of vestibular, I think that is the only condition where it will help you.
And I think what she meant about the DDABR, sir, is she has mentioned differentially diagnosis ABR. Probably she's saying about the protocol for this. So that already we have discussed.
okay, so I think you have a specific protocol for whether it is a click evoked ABR or stacked ABR or the CHAMP. Yes.
Why UCL will be reduced in SSCD, sir?
As I said earlier, that the UCL uncomfortable loudness level because of the missing bone, and as Neeraj mentioned in his interaction about the third window. So because of the missing bone, there is some amount of leakage of inertia through that particular third window. So when you are presenting the loud sound, there is a possibilities they get over sensation of the sound, and that leads to uncomfortable loudness. So you have to be careful when you are dealing with SCD cases while doing tympanometry, as well as even for obtaining the acoustic reflexes.
See, in terms of the normal anatomy, there is no mobile window on the vestibular side. It's only two mobile windows are there, which is oval window and round window. So whatever pressure is exerted through oval window, it kind of releases through the round window, and then the round window retracts and the pressure releases back through the oval window. So those are the only two ways. So whenever a sound, and this actually presence of the round window actually causes reduction in resistance for the sound towards the cochlear side. That's why all the sound energy is transmitted towards the cochlea and doesn't move towards the vestibule. Now, when there is a third mobile window, that is your bone plate is missing on the superior canal, so it will behave like how the round window is behaving. So whatever sound energy is going, it gets transmitted to both sides. So to reach the superior canal, it has to go through the saccule, utricle, and through the semicircular canal. So because of that, when you give a loud sound, there is excessive amount of sound going through the vestibular side. That means there is a vibrational energy going through the vestibular side, and that produces sensation of movement. Because it's happening on one side, the person will start feeling vertiginous. He will have vertigo. So because of that, the person will say, I can't tolerate this sound. And that's why the UCL is reduced.
I have one last question, sir. In vestibular neuritis, if speech audiometry show poor correlation, what will be the finding for ART and RDT?
In vestibular neuritis, if there is a poor correlation with
a speech audiometry, what will be the findings for ART and RDT?
See, first of
You
all,
want me to answer
you
that
have
question,
to look
Praveen?
for.
You want me to answer that question?
Yeah, Neeraj.
Okay. That scenario is highly unlikely. That's why I said I took it up. Because vestibular neuritis purely affects the vestibular nerve. So why should the speech identification scores be poor? So there is no chance of a speech identification score being poor. And therefore that scenario is highly unlikely.
Can audiologists perform glycerol test alone, or should we having help with the ENT?
Definitely you
Okay, if
can
you
do
believe
it.
me, I'm an audiologist. You're believing me, right? I'm an audiologist. So I've done my bachelor's in audiology, master's in audiology, PhD in audiology, everything in audiology, and I have done glycerol test for 4 to 5 years regularly. Only recently we have stopped doing it. We are not doing it anymore. If you are careful enough, it doesn't really have great side effects that it can do something very serious. And why I said careful enough is because if you have ensured that the person does not have diabetes, and what we mean by what Praveen meant by saying that diabetes mellitus is contraindication for glycerol is, remember, glycerol is actually very rich in glucose content. Okay, so you are giving so much amount of glucose to a person, his sugar levels will go very high, and that can be fatal sometimes. If suddenly it rises very high, it can be fatal in a diabetic especially. So you can't just rely on asking the patient whether you have diabetes or not. You should ensure, if you're giving glycerol test must be done on appointment, because glycerol has to be done in we call it as no oral feeds condition, NOF. Okay, it has to be done in no oral feeds. That means the person should not have taken anything orally or even intravenously. Actually, I mean, most often you will not do it for person who is having drips, so you will not do it anyway. But should not have taken anything, should not have consumed anything, not even water, for at least 5 to 6 hours. That's the very minimum. So if you want to do glycerol on somebody at 10 o'clock, you must tell this person from 4 o'clock in the morning you should not even have taken water. Okay, so this is very important. So that means you are always going to do it on appointment. So when you're giving appointment, please also tell the patient, get your fasting and PP sugar levels checked, or get a GCT or a GTT done. GCT is glucose challenge test and GTT is glucose tolerance test. So one of those two should be done, or at least fasting and PP should be done. So this is how
Yes.
careful you have to be. You can't just do a glycerol test on somebody who says, no, I am not diabetic. How does he know he's not diabetic? Has he got it tested yesterday, day before yesterday? So it has to be a very recent testing. So if you're careful enough in that regard, glycerol is not contraindicated for anything else. So you will be able to perform absolutely without any problem. Just remember that you have to use, and the concentration of glycerol is very important. So what Praveen said is for a glycerol which is of 95% concentration. So when you go to a chemist shop, you must ask for 95% concentration glycerol. For this glycerol, the amount he has described, which is, take the body weight of the person. For example, if a person's body weight is 60 kg, so 60 into 1.2, that is the amount you get in ml. So 60 into 1.2 gives you 72 kgs actually. Okay, so
Yes, sir.
72 so 72 ml of glycerol has to be mixed with the 72 ml of either pure water or saline, or with orange juice, one of them. I generally prefer saline. So but you can give it pure drinking water also, not a problem. So you give it same amount, so 72 ml of glycerol and 72 ml of water mixed together, and this has to be given to a person who has been fasting at least for 6 hours. So before
Yes, sir.
giving glycerol to the person, you should have done the pure tone audiometry, and then after giving glycerol, wait for 3 hours and do pure tone audiometry. But you can even do it after 1 hour. If you don't see a positive result, then you have to repeat at 2 hours and 3 hours. But if you see a positive result at 1 hour, you don't have to wait for 3 hours. So all three
Yes.
are possible. Normally people say 3 hours because at the end of 3 hours, if it is a Meniere's disease, you will definitely see a positive result. But remember, glycerol test, another thing that you need to remember is, if somebody has got, say, less than 35 dB of hearing loss, or if somebody has got more than 60 dB of hearing loss, a lot of the hearing loss is permanent in more than 60 dB and is not sufficient in less than 35 dB to give you a positive result. So glycerol test is best
Okay.
administered when a person has got mild or moderate or moderately severe degree of hearing loss not exceeding 60 dB. above and below that, there is no guarantee. Even if it is Meniere's disease, you may not see an improvement.
Shift you cannot see. So, but initially better to do with ENT.
Yeah,
If
I
you're not
mean, if you are
confident
not
enough.
confident enough,
No need, no need. Actually, if you ask me, I definitely never would want to do, would never require an ENT doctor. Where I have, although I was working in Bharati Vidyapeeth before coming to Aish, we had ENT doctors there, but I have never needed. I have, as I told you, for 5 years almost continuously, I have done glycerol all on my own without ever needing an assistance from ENT. You only have to tell the patient what could be the side effects. Patient may end up having severe headache. Sometimes migrainous patients may end up having severe headaches and all that. And sometimes this glycerol can create dysentery. So patient will have loose motion. That is those are the only major known side effects of giving glycerol. Other than that, as I said, if you have ruled out diabetes mellitus, absolutely no problem in doing it all alone yourself.
We are done with all the discussion, sir. Thank you so much,
thank you,
sir.
Chandan.
Thank you so much for
So
the presentation.
I hope all the
Yes,
participants could able to get some
definitely, sir.
info
Definitely,
to
sir.
utilize in their day-to-day clinical services or in their professional life. And once again, I would like to thank Chandan, you, and then Bishar team as well as Isha for giving me an opportunity, and of course our panelist, who could able to add on or supplement the questions which was not specific to my presentations, and give you more insight into it. So
Agreed, sir.
thank you one and
Agreed.
all. Thank you one and all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Amulya.
you, all the attendees. Thank you, Isha, Dr. Mulya, for helping this. All the attendees. Bye. Good night. See you again day after tomorrow.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you.